that this dichotomy I can't understand the logic and the reasoning behind such a dichotomy, because in a number of the countries, in the developed countries as well as developing countries, the government is the financier. So the government rarely provides its own goods and services. So when you're talking about roads, when you're even talking about government schools, you have to ask who is building the government school.
Right.
It's a private contractor.
So it goes to the market.
Yeah. So that public expenditure, in fact, when you're doing national income accounts, every expenditure is contributing to per capita income.
Yes.
So one man's expenditure is another person's income.
So why the concept you advocate?
But I think the feeling is that the private sector is more efficient than the government. So, and this is where I want to raise a very fundamental question when it comes to corruption that I referred to. How do you blame corruption only on the government? In fact, every contract that is illegal, is there some nonsense behind the contract in terms of rewarding the contract or some kickbacks, is given by the private sector. So it's to me it's a paradoxical situation where the beneficiaries of corruption or the perpetrators of corruption are actually the private sector. And there is no question of questioning the morality and the ethics and values of the private sector. Never has the private sector stood up and said that, hey, listen, we are the people who are actually taking the money. In India, we had this major Satyam, which was a big IT firm, and there's a promoters swindled a lot of money, and they're sitting in jail now. No voice of industry stood up and said, hey, listen, this company, the promoters were embezzling money, and we should condemn this kind of practice. On the other hand, you will find industrialists saying, oh, the government is corrupt, but they don't understand. In fact, I mean, it's a bad analogy, and I hope you won't use it. It is the same that happens when it comes to debates on sex work and women. Who are the perpetrators? Whom are we targeting? The sex workers. Prostitution is not good, it's not good for society, it's not good. But for every sex worker, there's a man. And nobody is asking the question, what is the morality of the man who is going there? It's always the morality of the woman who is questioned, because she's helpless, she's weak, and she's vulnerable. So there's very few who speak out in favor of sex workers. So, but the finger is never pointed at the man. Similarly, in the case of corruption, you find the finger is never pointed at the private sector. So why is it that you create this impression that you're more efficient? The banking scandals are coming out every day. The US is a classic example of corporate failures, and the voice has always been privatize. What do they say? Privatize the losses. Nationalize the losses. Give us bailouts. Why? If you're such a strong believer in the markets, you should back up and go. But no airline is able to close down, no private company closes down, because everybody wants support from the state. And in fact, if you look at the budgets of many of these countries, you find that the subsidies and the support going to government, private sector is phenomenal. But there is always, in economics, you have to do the cost benefit and the trade-off. Every tax concession that you give to the private sector, the money has to be taken off from somewhere else. And often, when you talk about the increasing crime or increasing pollution or traffic congestion, it's because the government is left with very little money to address these questions. So, in terms of the tension, it's a good tension to have, because I think money spent entirely by the government or entirely by the private sector is not good. But you definitely need this public dialogue to ensure that, listen, if the private sector is asking for these tax rebates and tax concessions, lowering the tax rates, the consequence will be that we will have to reduce the kind of healthcare that you get. Are you game for it? So that's what one has to argue today, that we will withdraw the following benefits from you as a pensioner, or for in health benefits or free schooling. We will withdraw that benefit. We can't do both. So society has to be, in fact, it's a major issue. In fact, in India also we are trying to argue, the tax to GDP ratio is about 18%, very low. Brazil is 35%. So when people say, hey, Brazil is doing so much, we say, yes, we can also do so much, but expand the tax base. Nobody wants to pay taxes. And what you're saying is not only for Italy, it's true here as well. When you talk about raising taxes, they say, oh my God, how can you do that? Because the government is not functioning.
And why the industrialists are against raising taxes and how the government will buy from them?
Yeah, but not, you see, they feel that they're not getting enough value for their money. That is why in India, for instance, they will say, why should you invest in government schools when there are private schools? Let the private sector do schooling.
But it's not either or.
No, it is not. But there is a legitimate point they make that we want the government schools to function better. So the point we also make is if the government schools are functioning better and your child is getting free education, who will send their kids to private schools? In Cambridge at Harvard, when I was a graduate student doing my PhD in economics there, all the colleagues would send their children to government schools in Cambridge because it was free. First, we couldn't afford to send, nobody as graduate students can say, after paying Harvard University the fees that they ask for, can send their children to private schools. But that as part, they were very good quality schools. Many of the residents of Cambridge would send their people to government schools. There were a few private schools, but very, very few. It made no difference. So one has to argue, and I think the pressure from the private sector has to be, hey, listen, you have to provide this, but ensure fantastic quality and we will hold you accountable. Just in the same way, but if you get hand in glove and say, okay, let's cut short, let's give them a shoddy building because, we'll do a kick-back over there and pay this chap off so the inspector doesn't come and all that is the problem.
So is this a message we can bring? We are going to interview managers of corporate responsibility in India. Maybe a message that we could collect and give it to them is that the responsibility of companies should not be so much in doing the social work, maybe also a portion, but should be about balancing properly the role of companies with the role of government and try to envisage there where they can cooperate better, rather than try to substitute the government into the social work.
Yes, absolutely. I'll give you an example. The issue of child labor, which UNICEF and other institutions in India have been fighting for a long time. I would say the CII, which is the Confederation of Indian Industries, or the Associated Chambers of Commerce, should stand up and say India should abolish child labor. We will not have any children working in any. They take a narrow perspective. They say in our factories no child is working. But then, what about the suppliers from whom you buy your raw materials? Are there children working in the fields? Are there children working in the small units that you're buying things from? So you take your responsibility a little further. But what would we say? We'd say, you just stand up and make a statement that India should abolish child labor by 2020. The benefits are enormous. You don't have to do anything as the CII. You just have to say, it is giving us a bad name. We cannot, Indian industry is not behind this at all. So we are standing up and saying, the organized industry is saying, we must get the government to abolish child labor. We must get the government to ensure that the quality of government schools improves. Why is the government not doing enough? Because the voice of industry is very powerful today. We want well-trained and well-educated workers. Majority of the children are in government schools where the quality of education is not as good. So we are going to insist that yes, we will be paying the taxes to the government, but the quality of government school has to improve. That is to be the conversation. Because we are paying in Delhi all the taxes that the Delhi government is. We want Delhi to be the safest city in India.
So let's invite them on board on this problem of evaluation.
Yes.
If we say that the linking gap between development work and the people is an evaluation which can be communicated to the people, let's ask the corporate responsibility to take care of that gap which is personally missing.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. In fact, I know a lot of NGOs and small groups that do small studies and evaluations. They don't want to take money from the government. Where do you get the resources? So I think there's a huge potential for the private corporate sector to set aside money to get some very independent, objective evaluations done of public programs. And with the voice that they have, to say, hey, listen, we did this study and it's showing us this. Your claim is here. Why? So in fact, that is a very, very strong and important role I see for the private sector, rather than trying to say that yes, we will run 10 schools or we will do this. They should do all small projects in their own ways, but they should not be doing what government is doing. They should not substitute the government. They should be very clear that we'll get better accountability from government by doing activities that will make them much more accountable. And I think that is where I would say you should put the money.
You see, Fausto, we're all developing a format. Now, what is essential is to put on the web a portion of these interviews, because from these interviews we are getting questions for the following interviews. And the whole story has to get the narrative of passing from one point to another point, from one research to another research. It has to give the feeling of the work in progress. It cannot be a series of questions that we all do to different people, and then we show the answer that the different people has given to the same questions. We are also searching for the questions. And so from one interview we got questions for the others, and we must put it on the documentary.